Zack's upper body was still mostly intact, but he couldn't drag himself out of the trapdoor without bashing the arrows that were skewering his leg. "Sephiroth!" Zack yelped, hoping he hadn't disappeared back into the fray. He felt Sephiroth's hand under his right boot and he pushed, thrusting himself up over the edge of the trapdoor. He forced a knee out onto the ground above, but even that jarred the end of the arrow in his thigh. He bit back a cry and slammed his palms into the dirt. Bent over the grass, he panted, and then he sneezed. Sneezed like he never had in his life, over and over until he thought it was never going to stop. What in the hell was going on? He tried to breathe. Whatever else happened, he couldn't stay here. The Scythes wouldn't pick a battle in the open by choice, but that didn't mean they wouldn't risk exposure to finish off someone vulnerable, especially if they considered that person tactically significant to Shinra, like a first-class soldier, for example. All of that meant that Zack needed cover, and he needed it as quickly as his messed-up leg would allow. Thankfully, Wutai wasn't typically short of forest land, and a dense patch of trees ahead looked like his most likely option. He struggled in an attempt to stand, but his left leg utterly buckled and he crashed back into the dirt. He sneezed bitterly. Apparently, that was something his body had no problem doing. He settled for a humiliating half-crawl, half-lurch down the hillside. His leg was reluctant to bend, wouldn't carry any weight. He couldn't drag it over the ground for fear of ripping out the still embedded arrows. It was like being saddled with hefting this useless great block of wood, except that every bump and bash sent jagged pain up his thigh. And still, for the life of him, he could not stop sneezing, and violently. Every one of them wrenched out from deep in his chest, upsetting his precarious, hard-won balance and risking sending him tumbling down the hill and onto the shafts that stuck dangerously out of his leg. As far as stealthy retreats went, it rated about a dead zero. It wasn't far. That was all that could be said for it. But it was something, because even the short distance had left him sweating and shaking and clinging to the branch of a tree to stay upright. Realistically, just being among trees wouldn't cut it, and if anyone did follow him down here, he had a feeling he would put up a pretty pathetic fight. He hurt. Bad enough that it took some effort to force his thoughts through the clouds of pain. But maybe, just as distracting was the frenzied itchiness swelling over and over to the point where he couldn't think, couldn't move, couldn't do much of anything until he'd let another slew of sneezes tear out of him. He clamped a fist over his nose, squeezing hard, begging whatever nightmare had caused this for one more minute. Just a little longer to try to think himself out of it. His breaths shook and juddered in his chest. In ordinary times he'd probably climb a tree. That thought was frankly hilarious now. There was a bush, but the arrows would drag against the rough branches. He could do something about the shafts, but that'd be costly both in terms of time and stamina. He'd have to wait until after the call to base. If someone found him before that, well, he had his sword and 3 good limbs. He'd have to hope that was enough. That prickling fire licked in his sinuses, wanting more. More sneezing, more gasping, more debilitating need. Zack scowled. I hadn't finished with the last bunch yet. Regardless, the fit ramped up with a new ferocity. He lost count. 6, 7, 8, before he reached a point where he could piece his thoughts together once more. Prioritise. He heard the word in Angeal's voice, springing right out of his memory like some distant training exercise. Survive. That was the next instruction. He winced and pushed the fingers of his free hand into his hair. Great work, Zack. Step 1, and he didn't even know if he had it covered. The briefing information had mentioned about 1,000,000 times that these guys were going to use poison. Poison gas, poison darts, poison blades, poison arrows too, most likely. But he'd had a remedy that should take care of it. Except that his head was swimming, and his gut was churning, and his shirt was drenched in sweat. And there was that too. The sneezing had never stopped, even after the remedy. Although, come to think of it, there had been 3 of them in the thick of that smoke, and he'd been the only one sneezing. And who ever heard of a sneezing poison in the first place? He decided to take an antidote for good measure and have done with it. Ramming the heel of a hand against his nose, he managed to gulp it down between sneezes. He was getting good at that. Too much practice. Come on, Zack, just focus. Survive! Survive! He ran a tentative hand down his side. His uniform was wet right across his hip, and his hand came away red. Definitely something to mark under not ideal, but it seemed like it had been a slow soak. Nothing was pumping or gushing. Most likely he'd have to do something about it, but it could wait for now. Okay, so step 2, right, Angeal? Time to call for help. He took out his phone with a shaky hand and searched for a number. His breath was already catching as the ringer sounded at the other end. "This is Soldier. Wutai South," came the answer at last. "Oh, damn it." "Oh," answered a surprised voice at the end of the line. Bless you." Zack grimaced and held the phone away. Seizing a breath, he brought it back to his ear to make a second attempt, but as soon as he opened his mouth to speak, his lungs were drawing in a gasp. Grunting in frustration, he hung up the call, pummeled at his nose with his knuckles, and tried for a second option. "Field request urgent. Mission ID 6212023. Backup second class. Concealed base. Entrance by trapdoor. Under grass on hillside. First aid and recovery to base." Well, that was that. Better just hope they checked their messages. He slumped over the branch, trying to get a better look at his leg. His uniform had begun to sag where the arrows had hit. The bloody patch near his knee and the one at his hip were closer now, threatening to join in one long sticky mess. Bandages were looking like a good idea. The problem was that the only things he had that were vaguely medical were field potions and materia. That was pretty standard. Med supplies for a soldier were all about combat. They were for putting the wind back in you if you missed your footing, smoothing over pulled muscles, maybe shaking off the odd little knock. Soldiers were Mako enhanced. They were agile. For the most part, they didn't get hit. He could just go get into some better cover, figure out the bleeding later. At least there was no short supply of bushes, but it did mean trying to do something about those arrow shafts. He rested his forehead against the bark of the branch, finding it harder than he expected to conjure up some movement. He waggled his head, trying to shake off the lethargy. What was wrong with him? Was he soldier or wasn't he? He could deal with a couple of arrows. Ugh, and a million sneezes. Gritting his teeth, he trusted his weight against his branch, inching close to the tree. At the trunk, he slid his hands as low as he could and bent his good leg. Pain and nausea hit him in a rush as he folded his body, and he had to grip tighter to the rough bark to avoid toppling back entirely. He made it, though. He hit the ground with an agonising and inelegant thump, followed by a burst of sneezing, but he still made it. With a confidence he didn't entirely feel, he closed his fist around an arrow at its entry point above his knee. He'd done first aid drills in basic training, and more still with Angeal. More than he thought were strictly necessary, to be honest. And this process had made sense in theory. He hadn't given quite so much thought about what he would do when the arrow had another end that was sharp and movable inside him. He was actually kind of grateful for the delay when he wrenched into the crook of his arm with another dozen sneezes. But at last it began to settle, and like everything else, this was going to have to be done quick, before the sneezing took over again. Before he could second guess himself, he brought a second hand above his fist to squeeze the wood back against itself. Zach's eyes crossed, and the ground lurched with the rocket of pain, but he felt the snap he was looking for. He paused for a ferocious round of sneezing. Then twisted the wood. Finally, the last stubborn connections gave way and he could throw the bulk of the shaft aside. Then he gathered himself and remembered that there was a whole other arrow still to do. He wrapped a hand around the one on his hip, remembered the pain from the first time around, and just sagged back against the forest floor instead. It would feel real good just to crash out, let the pain and the weakness and the constant itching melt into sleep. The others could find him, or not. But as soon as that thought occurred to him, he knew it was bad news. That was the first time he wondered if maybe he wasn't feeling so great. In a way that he couldn't entirely wave away as an effect of the pain or the constant sneezing. The pressure in his forehead and cheeks had spread and swollen into an all-consuming throb. Nausea was now a permanent knot in his gut, and every limb felt resistant and slow. Even his heart hammered in his chest. He blinked. Something wasn't right. "You need to fix this, Zach, quickly." There was Angeal again, knocking at his memories. Vaguely aware of something damp, he dredged up the energy to raise his arm. Blood dripped from his glove where he held the base of the arrow shaft. He took a breath and held it, before squeezing his eyes shut and wrenching himself from the ground. His uniform was sodden. By the tree and beneath where he'd leant on the branch, the leaves and dirt were red-tinged. Angeal was right, but it would have been great if his wisdom had come with a few situation-specific instructions. He was 1.5 miles from the nearest base with one usable leg and no supplies. Regardless, he was going to have to think of something. He pulled a potion from his belt and thumbed the latch. It wasn't going to close up his wounds, but it should buy him some time before he crashed out. He was really tearing through consumables. The sneezing was starting to intensify again. He forced his eyes open for a sweep of his surroundings before he lost control entirely. Some of the plants had pretty big leaves. That was about all Zach could come up with. But he didn't think he could wrap those tight enough to create any reasonable pressure, particularly with an arrow shaft to work around. He could go try to find something in the forest, but it had been hard enough to drag his leg around the first time. At this point, he wasn't sure he could even get to his feet. That's when he remembered the little backup dagger. Yes, that was workable. He could cut up his uniform. Of course, he'd have to get out of it first, and that meant getting it around the shafts of the arrows. His shirt would probably be the easiest, but it wouldn't give him a whole lot of fabric. He was just contemplating how he was going to take off his trousers when he recognised the sound of boots drumming in the distance. His fingers stretched for his sword, and he turned so fast that pain ripped the air from his lungs. but it was worth it. Those were Shinra uniforms. The adrenaline that had powered him evaporated instantly. Exhausted, grateful, he crumpled back against the blood and soil.